All right, buckle up, because today we are diving into some pretty intense stuff in Isaiah.
Yeah, heavy stuff.
We're looking at Isaiah 25.110a, and you know it by a different name probably, Praise for Deliverance.
Right.
And wow, you've brought us quite the feast of sources to dig into with this one.
A little bit of a blend of things, yeah.
We've got a sneak peek at an upcoming episode of Christian Business Connection. They're on 790 AM The Gospel.
That's right.
And you've provided what looks like your own personal deep dive into the historical context of Isaiah's time.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting, right?
Seems like ancient wisdom meets the modern boardroom, which I find fascinating.
It is. It's a fascinating intersection because, you've got this passage that's full of, intensely poetic imagery.
Right.
And deeply personal reflection on faith. But at the same time, it's grappling with these huge macro themes that feel, honestly, like they're ripped from today's headlines.
Yeah, it's true.
We're talking about social justice. We're talking about economic uncertainty, the role of faith in a world that seems to be changing faster than ever before. I mean, it's almost as if Isaiah had a crystal ball.
Right. And it's interesting to me that Christian Business Connection episode you've given us, they're really drawing these explicit connections between this ancient text and the very modern challenges of running an ethical business, which I love.
Yeah.
But before we get too far into their lesson plan and how they're breaking that down, I want to make sure I understand the backdrop a little better.
Okay.
So paint the picture for me. What was going on in Isaiah's world?
Sure.
What made these words of, praise and deliverance so powerful for the people hearing them for the first time?
Yeah. So imagine, if you will, a kingdom divided.
Okay.
The once united kingdom of Israel has split in two, and you've got the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom. And they are grappling for power, influence. And they are surrounded by all these other nations and empires that they have to contend with.
It's a pressure cooker already.
And then on top of that, you have this looming threat of the Assyrian Empire, which is... I mean, they were terrifying.
Right.
They were known for their brutality.
Right.
So you have this constant tension, this fear of invasion. It would be like,
Existential dread.
Existential dread every day.
Yeah.
But it wasn't just political turmoil, right?
Right.
Imagine a society that is also grappling with massive economic disparity.
Okay.
The gap between the haves and the have-nots is vast.
Yeah.
You've got exploitative lending practices. You've got corruption. It's the works, right?
Yeah.
And then to top it all off...
Oh, there's more.
You got a spiritual crisis brewing as well.
Okay.
So many Israelites had turned away from their covenant with God. They had chosen to worship idols. They had embraced the practices of their neighbors.
So it's like a perfect storm of chaos.
It is.
On every level.
On every level.
Political, economic, spiritual. Yeah. No wonder these people were, desperate for a message of hope and deliverance.
Absolutely.
It almost sounds like they were living in a real-life episode of Shark Tank, but, with way higher stakes.
That's a very astute observation.
Right.
Because actually... the economic realities of ancient Israel, they're surprisingly relevant to today's business world.
Really?
Oh, yeah. They had complex systems of trade, of debt, even what we might recognize as early forms of venture capital.
Get out of town.
Yeah.
So when Isaiah is talking about, God being a refuge for the oppressed and a stronghold in times of trouble,
right,
it's not just some abstract theological concept. He's speaking directly to people who are being crushed by the economic realities of the day.
Precisely. And this is where it gets really interesting, especially when we start to consider this angle from Christian Business Connection. They've taken these themes of trust, hope, and justice, which are so deeply rooted in the economic context of Isaiah's world, and they found some really powerful applications for business leaders today.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so we got ancient Israel going through some stuff, really tough times. And honestly, it sounds a little too familiar, for our modern struggles. But now I really want to dive into this passage.
Okay.
What are some of the key themes or phrases in Isaiah 25.110a that really jump out at you?
Yeah.
Especially knowing that it's going to be used as a springboard to talk about business ethics of all things.
Well, I mean, the passage is it's full of these vivid images,
It's Isaiah.
It's Isaiah. But one thing that really stands out to me right away is this unwavering declaration of God's faithfulness and his sovereignty, even when everything is just falling apart around you.
Right.
Isaiah says, and I'm paraphrasing a bit here, Lord, you are my God. I will praise you. I will exalt you because you have done these incredible things that you planned way, way back in the beginning. It's just this unshakable belief that God is in control. He's working everything out, even when it seems like the wheels are coming off the bus.
Which, I mean, talk about a message that resonates in the business world.
Oh, tell me about it.
Where things can change so fast. Like, we've seen it. A global pandemic hits.
Oh, yeah.
Supply chains go totally haywire. Some competitor you've never even heard of comes out of nowhere with this, like, game-changing product that's eating your lunch. It's like, talk about the rug being pulled out from under you.
All the time. And I think that's why it's so interesting that Christian Business Connection has chosen to focus on this theme of trust in God's sovereignty as like their first takeaway.
Okay.
Because they're arguing that this really ancient principle, this idea of trusting that God is ultimately in control, it's not just some, feel-good theological concept. It's actually the key to navigating the uncertainties and the pressures of the marketplace today.
Okay, so I'm intrigued, but like, how does that actually work in practice?
Yeah.
I mean, does trusting in God's sovereignty just mean like, sitting back and just waiting for divine intervention when your business is about to go bankrupt?
That's a great question. And honestly, I think that gets to the heart of what Christian Business Connection is really trying to do here. They're trying to bridge this gap between like this ancient wisdom, these timeless principles, and then like rubber meets the road application in a really practical way.
Yeah.
They're not advocating for, passivity. It's not about just like sitting back and letting things happen to you. It's more about a shift in perspective.
Yeah.
So imagine like you're a CEO, right?
Okay.
You're facing a major decision. It could be, launching a new product, acquiring another company, whatever. The stakes are high. There's a lot of risk, potentially a lot of reward.
Sure.
But instead of being completely paralyzed by the fear of making the wrong call or just being driven by like, okay, what's the bottom line? How do we make the most money? What if you approach that decision with the understanding that ultimately God is in control? You're not just at the mercy of market forces or the competition.
So it's about like, you make the wisest decision you can.
Yes.
Informed by your value, your faith.
Absolutely.
But then also acknowledging that there are just some things you can't control.
Precisely.
And that's where the trust comes in.
Yes. It's about aligning your actions with your beliefs, seeking God's guidance. I mean, honestly, that might mean taking some time for prayer, for reflection, and then trusting that even if the outcome is not what you expected, even if the deal falls through or the product launch doesn't go as planned, there's still a purpose in it.
Which, I mean, if you really think about it, that takes a ton of pressure off.
It really does.
You're not solely responsible for, like, manufacturing the perfect outcome.
It's a very humbling perspective, and it actually ties in really beautifully with the second takeaway that Christian Business Connection highlights from this passage, which is hope in God's deliverance. Because, let's face it, setbacks happen.
They do.
In any field, any endeavor, but especially in business, it's like a guaranteed part of the journey.
So if trusting in God's sovereignty is about, like, navigating uncertainty, then hope in his deliverance is about finding your footing when things actually do hit the fan.
That's it. You got it.
Okay, I like it. Tell me more.
Well, if we go back to the text, Isaiah uses this really evocative language here. He describes God as a refuge for the oppressed.
Yeah.
A stronghold in times of trouble,
Right.
He talks about God silencing, like, the uproar of foreigners, basically bringing calm in the middle of a storm.
Right.
And these aren't just, like, poetic flourishes. This is powerful stuff.
Yeah.
These are reminders that even when everything feels like it's falling apart around us, we can still find our security in something, something unchanging, something steadfast.
Right. So we've got trust as our, like, foundation, hope to guide us.
Right.
What a powerful combo, especially when you're trying to, like, build a business and keep it afloat and all of that.
Oh, yeah.
But there was a third thing.
There was.
Christian Business Connection was talking about.
Uh-huh.
And this one really caught my attention. God's care for the vulnerable. And, I think this one's really important, especially in a business context.
Yeah, it's huge.
Because I think it's easy to get so caught up in, the profit and the bottom line and all of that.
Oh, for sure.
That it's like, we lose sight of people sometimes.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's why this one really resonated with me too, especially thinking about, like, the day-to-day of running a business.
Yeah.
It's so easy to get laser focused on the numbers.
Right.
That you forget that there are actual human beings.
Yes.
Impacted by the decisions that you're making.
Okay, so how does Isaiah's message, going back to that, how does that challenge us to think differently about the way we treat people?
Well, one thing that strikes me about Isaiah is just he was like a fierce advocate for social justice.
Yeah.
He did not like mince words when it came to calling out injustice,
Right.
whether it was, the exploitation of the poor, the abuse of power. He constantly reminded the Israelites that their faith, it wasn't just about like rituals and, going through the motions.
Yeah.
It had to be lived out. It had to be demonstrated in the way they treated the most vulnerable people around them.
Okay.
And that is a message that is just as relevant, actually maybe even more relevant in the business world today.
Right. It really makes you wonder,
It does.
what would it look like to run a business where that idea, God's care for the vulnerable, wasn't just like some nice sounding slogan, to put on your website.
Right, or in your mission statement.
Yeah. But it was actually like woven into the very fabric of how you operate.
Totally. And I think that's kind of what Christian Business Connection is getting at here, because they use this really striking example from Isaiah 25, where God prepares this lavish feast, right? It's a feast of rich food, a feast of well-aged wines. It's open to all. And I don't know, to me, that's just such a powerful picture of abundance and generosity and I think really radical inclusion.
So, okay. We've talked about trust. We've talked about hope. We've talked about care for the vulnerable. We haven't really talked about the feast, which is, Isaiah,
Really,
right?
He's a poet at heart.
So what's the deeper meaning there?
Well, I think, that's the beauty of this passage. It works on these multiple levels, right? On the surface, you've got this image of just like pure celebration, delicious food, good wine, good company. But it's pointing to something much deeper. It's this metaphor for like the ultimate fulfillment of God's promises, the abundance, the joy that comes from living in right relationship with him. And with each other too, right? Because you don't feast alone.
So it's like, build a successful business, hit those goals. That's great. But also like, remember to savor it.
Oh, yeah.
Remember to enjoy the relationships and the joy of creating something, hopefully, that benefits other people.
That's it. Because if you're not enjoying it, then what are we even doing here? And I love how you picked up on that community aspect, because just as, God throws open the doors of his banquet to all these people, it doesn't matter, like their social status.
Yeah.
It makes me think, as business leaders, as people, who's at our table?
It's a good question.
Are we creating workplaces where everyone feels valued, respected? I don't care if you're the CEO or, you're the one cleaning the building at night.
Yeah.
Everyone has dignity. Everyone deserves to be treated with respect. Are we treating our suppliers fairly? Even if that means, maybe our profit margins are a little bit slimmer.
Right. Right. It's about seeing your business maybe as a force for good in the world.
Yes.
Not just like a money-making machine.
I love that.
And I think that brings us right back to, Isaiah's big vision, right?
Yes.
He's got this picture of a world where those barriers are broken down between us, where God swallows up the covering that is cast over all peoples.
Yeah.
Which is, wow, what an image.
Right.
As we kind of wrap up here, you've given us so much to think about. What do you think? What are those coverings that kind of obscure our own vision, both as individuals, as society, especially in the business world, where it can get so competitive?
Absolutely.
So easy to get, like tunnel vision.
I think so often we get blinded by greed, by competition, by this need for like whatever the next big thing is,
Yeah.
And we miss the forest for the trees. We miss the bigger picture. We miss the people right in front of us.
Those are some really like potent questions that I don't think there are easy answers to.
Yeah.
So what do you think? What did it take to start to tear down some of those internal walls, to approach business and honestly just life in general with that renewed sense of purpose and generosity and connection that we're talking about?
Well, I think that's the real question, isn't it?
It is.
Maybe that's the real feast we're all searching for.
Maybe you're right. And on that note, thank you for unpacking this passage.
It's been my pleasure.
You've given us so much to think about. And I love the way that you've connected these ancient truths, these ancient ideas to our modern lives in such a practical way. And to you, the listener, thank you. Thank you for joining us for this incredible journey through the book of Isaiah. Until next time, keep diving deep.